Some of us in this community participated in a play entitled A Goodly Heritage that Wynn referred to, written by Jenny Schrag, who gave it this past March, in which she spoke of our strong interest in music. And from A Goodly Heritage, I quote, "For the Schweitzers, music took a significant role in church and in all of life. In 1874, as the Kotasufka group moved through Hamburg, Germany on their way to America, they joined a Mennonite church for worship. The pastor there was deeply moved by a group of men who sang in four-part harmony. In 1876, while still meeting in the immigrant house, Hoffningsfeld formed the first choir in the Kansas Conference. The first generation of Swiss Walhenians soon owned pianos, pump organs, violins, violas, and within a few decades, brass and wind instruments were found in the homes. For example, the Stuckey families at the Alta Mill had their own orchestra and played for community events. Eaton Mennonite performed with their own choir and orchestra Handel's Messiah annually for a number of years. Minutes of every meeting and programs of nearly every event in the churches and communities included the singing of hymns or other songs or an instrumental number. Music, according to the Schweitzer descendants, is often mentioned as being a very significant part of the heritage," end quote. So let's continue to celebrate this musical history. At this time, I'd like to welcome McCabe Juhnke, Assistant Teaching Professor of Musicology at Ohio State University, as he leads us through a music historical journey centering on Schweitzer's American heritage as expressed in song. Austin grew up in North Newton, frequently visiting his grandparents in Mound Ridge. He has written and researched on American Mennonite music with a particular interest in ways music intersected with the politics of race and ethnicity in the wake of the civil rights movement in the United States. And I would also like to welcome Dr. Bill Eash, who will lead us in the singing of hymns this evening. He is an Ohio native, graduating with a music performance degree from Bluffton University, followed by extensive vocal study in Vienna, Austria. He earned a master's and a doctoral degree in choral conducting from the University of Iowa. He taught in Iowa, but more recently in Kansas at Newman University, then Bethel College for 23 years, leading men's ensemble, women's chorus, Bethel College concert choir, among other things, I'm sure, and the annual Masterworks concerts. As a church musician, he has led choirs in various churches, including Presbyterian, Methodist, and more recently Bethel College Mennonite Church. His interest in hymnology has led him to conduct hymn sings and hymn leading workshops in a number of states, and he led hymns at the 1985 Mennonite Assembly in Ames, Iowa, and the Joint General Conference MMC Convention in Nashville in 2001. Now retired, he enjoys traveling, camping, reading, volunteering, visiting family, and now I hope visiting with a bunch of Schweitzers and friends. Welcome both of these gentlemen.
Good evening, everyone. Can we get the bank of lights to lower? Excellent. And thank you especially to whomever showed up on short notice to run this projection system. I don't know your name, but thank you very much. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the, I don't know, I hope entertaining and elucidating visuals that are going to go along with this presentation here. So let me see if, oops, am I able to move? I am, okay. Then I think we are prepared. So thank you for being here. I apologize if, so I have to say, I am an academic and a scholar of music in the field of musicology, which means that what I'm good at in particular is reading and writing about music. But you don't have to be any good at actually doing music. I don't know, I can ask maybe Bill later, you know, if I didn't any good in the choir when I was at Bethel, but I'm going to be doing quite a bit of talking today, but interleaved with a number of hymns that I hope that you'll join me in. You will be, in my teaching, I will sometimes play recorded examples of things. Here, I'm hoping that you all will be the sounds of the examples in this presentation. So I'll begin. So thank you for coming out this evening to sing some songs and think about music in relationship to our Swiss Bohemian Mennonite heritage this evening. Though I now work and teach at Ohio State University, as you heard in my bio here, my own story begins just down the road a ways in North Newton, Kansas, and my childhood featured many visits to my grandparents in rural Mound Ridge. After graduating from Bethel College, I completed my PhD with research focusing on the politics of American Mennonite music in the 1960s and on. I am not, however, specifically a historian of Swiss Bohemian Mennonite music. I don't know if there are any out there who have studied that in particular. And as far as I know, nobody has set out to study Swiss Bohemian musical practices in a comprehensive way. And I apologize if you were expecting a kind of comprehensive overview of Swiss Bohemian music this evening, that I cannot claim to give you that tonight. Instead, I would like to trace a few of the notable shifts in the history of Mennonite church music from the perspective of a Schweitzer Mennonite heritage in America. As I do, we will sing several examples led by Professor Eash, and with accompaniment from Matthew Graber, whose name hasn't previously been mentioned here, but thank you very much to Matthew. We'll start in Bohemia before 1874, stop off with examples from many of the major Mennonite hymnals of the last 150 years, that is since 1874, and end roughly in the here and now with a special song led by Nathan Stuckey, who many of you are probably looking forward to hear more from on Sunday. Yes, you'll likely get to hear more from him at that point, although I don't know, maybe he'll be singing as well that day, but I imagine he'll be doing some talking. Before we get to the music, however, I'd like to share a few ideas that shape the way I'm thinking about heritage in this talk. And maybe some of these resonate a little bit with what Dr. Gearing was talking about in terms of some of the generational approaches to thinking about our heritage here. I suppose I'm another generation removed, or two, not sure how we would count those. But in any case, when we talk about the ideas of heritage and tradition, there's sometimes an impulse to peel back the layers of recent history to attempt to rediscover a more authentic or perhaps untainted version of something. Perhaps this is what some of the 1949 Mennonite scholars were looking at when they were looking back. We've lost something. What is that thing that we've lost, right? And I think that's still, maybe we've changed a bit, but I think that is still a common impulse that we can have. Let's get back to the real thing, right? When was that real Swiss Bohemian music? Before we did X, Y, or Z, you know, recently. However, across time and place, human individuals and groups tend more often to borrow, to mix, and to remake, using whatever resources they have at hand to create meaningful activities in their lives. These activities sometimes later come to be understood as traditional, quote unquote, but they rarely are completely distinct from other cultural and historical streams and narratives. So if I can bring up Bonabrogi for the second time from this pulpit this evening. I mean, has anybody thought about the etymology of this word, right? Bona, a German word for beans, and brogi, which I guess I haven't done a deep study, but which to my ears sounds very much like the Polish word pierogi. A German and a Polish word coming together, becoming a kind of traditional food of the Swiss Bohemians. What stories are behind that, that create this kind of interesting mixture that then has come to be claimed as a part of our heritage in the form of mashed up beans in a sweet roll with sweet sauce? In other words, we could say that the story of Schweitzer's has perhaps always been Schweitzer's and friends. That is, a story as much connected to other stories and other people as it is distinct from them. Our musical heritage, then, is one that carries traces of the many people and places that have shaped our communities over these past 150 plus years that I'll be covering. Okay, so to go back 150 plus years to Bohemia, Russia, present-day Ukraine. These processes of borrowing and remaking certainly bear out in the history of Schweitzer's and church music. Schweitzer's in the United States certainly have hardly been strict preservationists when it comes to practices of singing, as you'll find throughout this presentation. Indeed, it's probably a rare day when we sing a song that our Swiss and Swiss-Russian forebears might have sung. We get a small hint of what church song might have been like for those Swiss Bohemians living in Bohemia prior to 1874. In the Kaufmann family record, this is the book that we just colloquially call the Kaufmann book, this big old gray book. I think we had it in the second edition, however. Here I'm quoting from the 1963 edition. Does this sound like a church service you would like to be at? The church Vorstand, that is the council, was composed of preachers, deacons, and Vorsänger, that is song leader. The church services lasted 2 and 3 hours. I'm hoping that our hymn sing can maybe make it that long this evening, with 1 hour at least devoted to singing, which was from the for which the Ausbund was used. Now, I'm a teacher primarily in my everyday, and so this is something I do in my class quite often. Get a sense of what do people know, what maybe are they yet yearning to learn. So how many people in here have heard of the Ausbund? Okay. How many people have not heard? I suppose maybe it's the rest of you. Okay. So about 2/3 of you in there know of this book. I'm not sure when I heard about this book. I don't know if I would have known it as a younger man, but it's something that's come up in my research quite often. And this is a book that was created by, the texts were created by prisoners, Anabaptists, who were persecuted and imprisoned in Passau in southern Germany. And this had a core of texts, around 40 texts that were written by these imprisoned Anabaptists. A few years later, in 1564, this book became something that was published and bound as a book, and later took on this title, the Ausbund, which means paragon. So in 1564, this is the first edition. The only known extant edition of this is in the Mennonite Historical Library in Goshen College. And here it is. It was recently restored. If you're interested in old books, there's an article I could point you to about the restoration process here. But a wonderful old book that's now less falling apart here. The early Anabaptists had a tenuous relationship with music. The Anabaptist leader Conrad Grebel, for one, wrote against the use of singing altogether. But these Anabaptists were hardly, especially early on, centrally organized or kind of a monolithic top-down kind of group. And these prisoners apparently had no qualms about writing their own songs, and as a way, no doubt, of giving them strength through these times of trial here. And as these songs later became collected, this book went through many editions. And some of you may know that even to this day, many Amish groups still sing exclusively from the Ausbund. Not probably the first edition, unless they're visiting the historical library, but future editions that have reprinted these songs. So this is often a text that people look to as informing kind of a core part of tradition here. And it may be tempting, well, first, before we do that, does anybody know what this looks like inside? How many people have looked at a copy of the Ausbund on the inside? Okay, a few people in here. Here we go. Okay, so this is a later edition. This is 1785. So maybe this is an edition, however, this was printed in Germantown. I couldn't find one that was printed in Europe that was available in these nice scans. But from Germantown, Pennsylvania, giving you already a sense of the way that this book was reprinted and taken over to the United States in different waves here. But yes, so here we see a hymn. Now, is anybody surprised, or does there appear to be anything missing here? Or is anybody ready? Would anybody like to sight sing the hymn? Okay, so maybe it's quite obvious, but in this hymn, well, I mean, what are you going to do? How do you sing the music, right? So this was a tradition of singing from the Ausbund that was most likely something done through this process of that role of the Vorsänger that was mentioned earlier. The Vorsänger would take the role of leading the congregation through this, typically line by line. Has anybody sung like that? It's sometimes called lining out. Has anybody done any lining out in here? Okay, I've seen a few hands. There are some revivals of this kind of tradition in various places. So what we can see here, maybe, whoops, apologies for the tech. Sorry, this is coming through quite small here, but I'll read it for you. If you see where that red arrow is pointing, you can see in translation the 131st Psalm, which is one that I'd like to sing together here in a moment. It says, a spiritual song to the tune, Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir. And you may know this piece. Does anybody know who's attributed as the writer of Aus tiefer Not? Does anybody know? It's Martin Luther. So Martin Luther, of course, the famous spark to the Lutheran Reformation in 1517. So interesting here, now the actual song that's indicated to be sung here, however, is not Aus tiefer Not. Historically, hymns, so the tunes and the texts, are separable pieces. You wouldn't necessarily have to use one text with one tune, and sometimes you would write a text to a pre-existing tune. In fact, that would be the most common way, likely in, say, the 16th century, 17th, 18th century. You might have a tune in mind and you write a new text to it. So this is informing the singers, okay, you all know Aus tiefer Not, right? That's the tune that we use for this song, and here are the words, right? And then the Vorsänger would have the role of starting everybody out, typically line by line, and having them sing through here. Okay, so how did they actually sing it? Well, we don't, of course, have any recordings of singers from Bohemia. It would be interesting and probably shocking to hear how this might have been performed. And I hope that maybe we have audio. Will audio come through the presentation? I guess we'll find out momentarily here. But there is a style of singing that typically develops in these contexts where you are singing without looking at notes. Does anybody have a sense of what might happen? Let's say over a century, you never look at the notes, all you do is you and then your children and maybe their children come to worship and sing the same song over and over again, but you never have a point of reference in terms of written notation. It's going to change, yeah, certainly it will change, right? The telephone game, right? Isn't that the fun of that? You pass it down and then over time things change, right? And I think this might be, do we have any sound? We do? Okay. So this is another, so to get into this here, actually let me go to my next slide. Apologies here. Let's skip this example here. But I want to make note of this and then we'll go back to the example in just one second here. But this is actually something that happens not just in Mennonite churches, although it's been noted recently by musicologists who have studied Amish singing from this very same book here, that there's a way of singing that seems to evolve in these places. Musicologist Nicholas Temperley has described this style of singing. So you come back week after week, but you're never looking at any text. He says, in places where congregations are left to sing hymns without musical direction, that is, nobody's telling them what the notes need to be necessarily. They sing it from memory week after week. For long periods, a characteristic style of singing tends to develop. Tempo becomes extremely slow, the sense of rhythm is weakened, extraneous pitches appear, oh my, and sometimes coinciding with those of the hymn tune originally, but sometimes inserted between them. People just, who knows, the spirit moving, right? Perhaps new notes tend to appear. And the total effect, he says, may be dissonant. So this sounds very different. Luckily, we do have recordings of people who continue to sing in this. It's sometimes still referred to as the old way of singing. Now, for a point of reference, to go back to Aus tiefer Not, now you might be, where did the first thing come from, right? I mean, they had to have a point of reference somewhere. Well, okay, Aus tiefer Not, Mennonites, Luther wrote his own tune to this, which apparently didn't get a lot of play in Mennonite circles, unfortunately, or I don't know if he cared particularly. But the tune that they began to sing Aus tiefer Not to, the hymn that he wrote, was actually a secular song by the name of Es wollt ein Mädlein Wasser holen. So a song apparently about, a maiden fetching water, that then took on the text of Aus tiefer Not, then becomes associated with Aus tiefer Not, and reused in this hymn that we'll sing here in just a moment. But if we can play this example, here is an attempt at recreating a kind of medieval version of what this song might have sounded like. If you would like to turn to your Voices Together number 45, and I don't know if we can get maybe some of the back lights up just a little bit, we will be singing this piece here. O Gott, Vater, sometimes known as the Lob song. We'll be singing it together, but you can try to follow along if you're a music reader. You can try to follow along and see if you notice any similarities with this medieval recreation of this secular song that people sang Aus tiefer Not to, that then later became the thing that they sang O Vater to in later years. So if you want to try to listen for some of those similarities as this example plays. Could we play the example? Could be that we may not have the sound. PowerPoint thinks it has the sound. I don't think they had this problem in the 1974 meeting either. If we don't have it, it's not essential. In any case, you'll get to hear a version of this melody in a second. It's a little bit unfortunate. I don't know if we go 2 slides ahead here, if that one happens to work. If we can get it, here's an example of lining out, but if you are a note reader, you can maybe see, although this is a bad transfer of this particular transcription, but where you could look and compare between what you have in Voices Together number 45 and what we see, even just in terms of the kinds of notes that we see here. Does the sound work on this one? Okay, it would seem not, and that's okay. Those are the only 2 recorded examples I have. But maybe you can see some of this, what Nicholas Temperley was talking about. Many notes. Each syllable now, instead of getting 1 note, is having a whole string of notes. A verse takes 5 minutes to sing, something like that. And this has slowed down. And one could surmise that perhaps this is the style of singing that you might have heard. Could you go in a time machine back to Bohemia? Some kind of slowed down with many added notes, quasi in unison, but everybody having their own kind of take on what that melody might be as they sing together. So we'll move on to a little bit more, it's time to sing. We'll move on to a more recent version of this that appears handily enough in the Voices Together hymnal as number 45, if you haven't turned there already. O Gott Vater, which is, in Amish traditions, one of the most beloved songs out of the Ausbund, although typically sung in the old way. Here we have a version of it that's been nicely notated for us and straightened out. So I will turn it over to Professor Eash, and we will sing, let's attempt verse 1 in German, and then why don't we sing verse 1 in English and then verse 2 in English. So 3 total verses. Matthew Graber will play the entire melody through for us so we can get it in our ears, and then we can proceed with these 3 verses. So here, an instance of heritage, right in our own hymnal. Actually, all of these selections today are coming out of this hymnal, in part because it's useful, because we have this hymnal, but in part because, these things keep getting embedded and sometimes revived, as we'll find out of the rest of this presentation, in various iterations of these Mennonite hymns. Okay, so moving now over the threshold, over the ocean, and to the United States, where the Swiss Bohemians settled right in this neighborhood here. So as we turn to the Schweitzer experience in the United States, we see a branching out to broader German repertoires beyond those of the Ausbund. Soon after their arrival, Schweitzer congregations joined the General Conference Mennonite Church, which strengthened connections to other Mennonite groups, some of which had come over just right around the same time and were from even, neighboring regions, but shared different kinds of music repertories during this time period. And the first hymnal that was published after the arrival from the General Conference that the General Conference organized in 1890 was the Gesangbuch mit Noten. Does anybody remember this hymnal? Being around, maybe, left in pews and maybe sometimes used here or there. This was a hymnal that actually got used many times and went through many editions. It was quite popular and got used well until the transition to English. Now, Gesangbuch mit Noten, an interesting title here. So, mit Noten, with notes. Okay, finally, right? We're in familiar territory again, right? Oh, you've given us the notes, and this was something that was worthy in 1890 of actually noting, no pun intended, right? That this is a book that you're going to have the text, the musical text with you as in addition to the actual text, written text of the hymns. The book aimed to unite various European repertoires of these newly arrived Mennonites who had joined the conference, and it drew heavily on a Gesangbuch zum gottesdienstlichen und häuslichen Gebrauch, which was a hymnal that was published by the Conference of South German Mennonites in of course, South Germany, and the so-called Geistreiches Gesangbuch, which was used by Dutch-Prussian Mennonites in the 18th century, with later editions that were published in Odessa, Ukraine, and used by Mennonites in that region as well. But unlike the Swiss Walhenians, who sang apparently from the Ausbund, other Russian and German Mennonite immigrants that were in the General Conference had adopted the various available repertoires of the German-speaking lands that they inhabited before coming to the United States. So this included notably a lot of Lutheran influence in those environments, which brought a tradition of chorale singing. And these chorales traced to the Reformation, and many were written by Martin Luther himself, such as a great example being Aus tiefer Not, which we will not sing today, but a great example of one of these chorales. I do want to stop, however, with this Gesangbuch mit Noten and pull out another piece here. So this book also adopted newer songs in the repertoire of German music during this time period, such as a piece by August Rischer, which some of you may know, Gott ist die Liebe. Now, how many of you grew up singing this song? I'm curious. Okay, quite a number of you. Being someone who attended a mixed heritage Mennonite congregation in Newton, this wasn't one that we encountered, but I imagine maybe in the walls of this church we might have heard it in Sunday school quite frequently, perhaps. I know that this is something I can recall from Schrag reunions that I attended as a kid. Sometimes this would be a song that children would, the young kids would go up and demonstrate that they had learned a song. It was Gott ist die Liebe. Or I think typically in the Schweitzer, Gott ist die Liebe, right? Kind of flattening out that schwa sound at the end there. So this seems to have been a standard actually among many German-American Sunday school songbooks in the later 19th century as well. And perhaps was it in Sunday school? I don't know. Maybe somebody knows from your own stories. And in a question, if we have time for questions at the end, I'd be willing to open it up. If maybe your grandparents or parents learned this in Sunday school. In any case, why don't we go ahead and sing this song? This was written by August Rischer, but also borrowing a tune in this instance. Interesting that this is kind of in a similar period of evangelical type songs in the United States, which we'll learn as well here. But this was written for a kind of evangelical purpose. Rischer was a part of a group of German Lutherans who were hoping to kind of re-Christianize Germany in the period of industrialization, where they thought they saw people kind of slipping away. And so some of these songs are quite catchy and useful potentially for that. So let's return to singing here. This one is in Voices Together, number 158, and we do have both the German and an English translation here. I think we should do 3 verses of the German, and then do 1 verse in English, perhaps, for those of us who might be a little rusty in our German and might like to know what the words are saying. We can finish off the final verse in English. So, I'll turn it over again to you.
Keep in mind that that 3rd verse is located below the notes, right? You'll find it there.
In the following decades, anti-German sentiment during the First World War hastened a language transition to English among Schweitzers and other German speakers and Mennonites in the United States. The next major General Conference denominational hymnal was published in 1940 and was published in English. And it maintained in translation many of the Lutheran chorales used in the Gesangbuch mit Noten, and also incorporated many of the popular English language hymns of the day, which would include, there's the hymn, the hymnal, many hymns from the Moody revivals. How many people are familiar with Moody Sankey revivals? Okay, maybe a few here, probably not from in person, I would imagine. As these were revivals from the latter part of the 19th century, and this affected very much English-American hymn repertoires, which experienced a wave of new songs marked by simple harmonies, catchy, repeated refrains, and themes of personal salvation, known as gospel songs. These songs became popular in association with a new wave of mass evangelistic revivals led by Dwight L. Moody and musician Ira Sankey in the latter part of the 19th century. Here you can see Ira Sankey on the right standing in front of the organ, and one wonders if perhaps this was a driver for the purchase of these small organs. I know I was just at my grandmother's old house earlier today and reminded that there was always an organ there. In any case, these gospel songs must have been thoroughly embedded in Schweitzer communities, as my own Schweitzer grandmother used the tune for When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, another Dwight Moody associated gospel hymn, as a lullaby. Nighty, 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 nighty. Which we still sometimes sing in our family traditions today. I want to turn now to a song that probably many of you know from another great composer of these gospel hymns, Fanny Crosby, the tune by Phoebe Knapp. And this is Blessed Assurance. Fanny Crosby was one of the most popular hymn writers of this period, and her songs, along with those of Ira Sankey, who we saw earlier at the organ here, constituted an essential element of the energetic, moody revivals. And Crosby's Blessed Assurance, composed in 1873, appears as number 480 in the Mennonite hymnary, so was certainly something that circulated perhaps in these, well, maybe not in, this is before the fire, I suppose, but at this church and other churches in the area. So why don't we turn now to the version of this that is printed in our Voices Together hymnal, which is number 435. And I think we can sing all three verses of this, so I'll turn it again over to Professor Eash.
Let's stand to sing.
Though these wonderful and beautiful gospel hymns appeal to many in the American Mennonite laity, some music committee members began to view them with skepticism. By the 1960s, the General Conference again moved to revise their denominational hymnal. That would have been this 1940 hymnal that they were looking to revise. This time in cooperation with the Old Mennonite Church, or the MCs, which maybe today we think of as, not a big deal, but I think at the time this was kind of one of the first moments, in a sense, kind of presaging perhaps the MC-USA merger a number of decades later, that these groups worked together. The cooperation between these two groups heightened questions of what might constitute a shared heritage of Mennonite singing across these two groups in new ways. And the result was, in part, a process of figuring out which hymns could be considered part of the tradition and which hymns were new or even foreign in some ways to these Mennonite repertoires. A question that we don't really see asked in the same way in any of these previous hymnal projects. But the attitude towards these gospel hymns is summed up fairly well in a quote here from Walter Yoder, or Walter, I suppose maybe he would have said, who was a professor at Goshen College during this time period and was on the MC committee, but these kinds of things were echoed by both sides, the GCs and the MCs. And he wrote in an address that he gave in 1960, or spoke, and said, "An unfortunate thing happened to our Mennonite church music in the latter quarter of the 19th century." Think of that image I showed earlier, that mass revival. I'm sure something like that was in his mind here. When the church was changing from German to English language, the Great Awakening, he's calling it here, took place during those years. The spirit of evangelism and the organization of Sunday schools, which was a hot topic of debate during this period in Mennonite circles. And the beginning of missions, Bible conferences, and young people's Bible meetings were being introduced. All of these new activities crowding in on the church must have shaken the church to its very foundations. The unfortunate thing was, he goes on, that with this change of language and the taking on of many new activities, the church dropped its good German hymnody and substituted for them the weaker texts and lighter tunes of the gospel hymns. Right? These are not serious songs, you know, at least for some on the hymn committee. And I think they were, you know, there were people, regular Mennonites out there who mostly disagreed with them, right? But this was a convenient style of music against which they could define a new idea about traditional Mennonite music, right? The styles that the committee seemed to agree on as a kind of heritage music included chorales, right? Good old German music. Songs from the Ausbund, also good old German music, and by Anabaptists, you know, bonus. And the songs from the 19th century singing school tradition, which didn't, to my knowledge, make it much to this area, but for the Eastern Mennonites was a very important tradition, and we'll get to a little bit of that here in a second. Those things were kind of agreed upon as this is kind of core tradition, but these gospel songs, they were a bridge too far. And though they sometimes tolerated these gospel hymns, and indeed included them because they had to, right, if they wanted people to use the book, they were considered often too recent, too popular to be really properly Mennonite in some views here. And the result of this joint hymnal project, which you may already know, but I have not said yet, is the 1969 red hymnal called simply the Mennonite hymnal. And I suppose this is a hymnal that many of us might have been the first hymnal that we kind of learned to love, depending on your age group here. But this, interestingly, I've done some research in the archives on this, and L. Rose Zook, a little tidbit, who was the representative of Mennonite Publishing House, somehow this idea that this was much more Mennonite and we were kind of getting towards something, you know, more truly Mennonite than we used to have, seems to have filtered into his thinking, and he commented in a letter to Mary Oyer, the great and late Mennonite hymnologist who was on the committee at the time, that, you know, I feel that this book is more Mennonite than any other hymnal so far published. What might that mean? Well, I think, you know, part of it has to go with those things that I've already mentioned, right? It's not new, you know, we're going back to the old stuff here. And in this context, we find that, so the result of this was this hymnal here, and as congregations adopted this hymnal in the 1970s, the mood more broadly in America was also a reflective mood, thinking about heritage. They had picked up, many Americans had picked up the language of ethnic and racial heritage from the civil rights movement, you know, where the language of ethnicity and race was used for racial justice advocacy in different forms. And they now many white Americans, among them Mennonites too, began to apply this language in thinking about the role of ethnicity to their own stories and their own senses of heritage. At the same time, many European American groups planned centennial celebrations, right? The 1970s. Among these groups was, of course, Schmecca, but there are all kinds of other heritage groups that were founded during this time period. And it's interesting, I'll just show, so it's fair to say that this mood was there during this time period. And this is a period in which there is a certain little hymn that appeared at number 606, which started to take on, I argue, a new kind of meaning within this context of thinking about ethnic heritage and identity. This is a hymn that comes from actually Joseph Funk. How many people in here have heard of Joseph Funk? Okay, a few. Now, if you were a Virginia Mennonite now, you would know the name Joseph Funk, a very well-known Mennonite publisher of what are essentially singing school songbooks here. Now, this screen is a little small, and I apologize, but what you can perhaps see here, or imagine, is that within this book, which was called the Harmonia Sacra, which has gone through a number of different editions, there are actually shaped notes that indicate which parts of the scale you're supposed to be singing. Has anybody sung from shaped notes in here? Okay, a few. This was an instructional book, and it was aimed at a general audience. And to my knowledge, didn't really enter Mennonite repertoires in, this was the 1876 edition, I believe, here. But there is a little song in there that came to be quite important. Under the tune title Dedication Anthem here. This would come to be number 606, a little song that ended up being in the choral section of this book because they thought, well, this is going to be a little bit too hard for general folks to sing, so let's put it in when a choir might sing it. Interesting to note here that actually the tenor line has the melody, as would have been common practice in earlier decades, rather than it gets switched in the versions that we all know well. Now, how this song actually became a kind of standard Mennonite heritage hymn, I don't know the whole story, and some of you lived through this period, and maybe you can fill me in on the details a little bit here. But it is interesting to look in this moment of 1974. Mennonites in the General Conference were meeting in St. Catharines, Ontario that year. Was anybody there in St. Catharines? Okay, a few of you. Maybe you can fill in what might have happened here. But the centennial was all apparently kind of the buzz, right? And you could see in the Mennonite advertisements, you could buy your centennial spoon. Did anybody get the spoon? Does anybody have the spoon in here? Maybe, I don't know. In any case, you could order a spoon for the centennial, and there was this meeting in Ontario where the centennial and music was a huge portion of what went on. There was a centennial folk opera. Does anybody remember the bridge who was there? Maybe it didn't make that big of an impression. Oh, and then that was a waving of hot, blowing the heat away, not a raising hand. But this bridge kind of strikes me as perhaps a Mennonite version of something like Fiddler on the Roof, right? Where they're kind of looking back at tradition and they come back decade after decade and kind of check in on this. In any case, by the end of this conference, I don't know what hymns were sung and when, but here's a little summary or reflection from Bertie Wiebe, who was the editor of the Mennonite magazine, the GC periodical, who said, I have heard ever since St. Catharines, now I don't know what happened, someone tell me if you know, people speak of 606 in the Mennonite hymnal as the Mennonite hymn. After Bluffton in Toronto, I will never forget this version of Praise God from Whom All Blessings Flow. May it truly be a theme song for many Mennonite conferences to come. Okay, so why don't we go on to sing this song that has become so well loved in many Mennonite communities here. This appears as number 70 in the new version here. Voices together, number 70, Praise God from Whom. And if we could have the lights again.
You want to stand again, sing? Let's do it. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise all creatures here below. Praise all creatures here below. Praise God above. Praise God above.
a wonderful hymn, and I don't know how many services that might have closed. I think I heard a story. Maybe this was from Freeman, that there was one church service after this had become an established practice to sing, that this didn't get planned, and it wasn't sung after so many Sundays of it being sung, and someone stood up and said, "Excuse me, we cannot end the service yet. We have not sung 606. Is this a story? Am I making this up? I'm looking to some Freemanites. This might have been something I made up in my head, but it sounds nice. Okay, but unfortunately we haven't quite made it to the present. So we have one more example here, which I think will be pleasing in its own way. So to kind of sum up some of the developments since the 1960s, I want to turn back a little bit to the 1960s, where we see young Mennonites at places like Bethel College, moving my own slides but not these here, who grew up with peace values and learning this in church, and then suddenly around them developed a whole youth movement of peace and anti-war, and the soundtrack to this movement was, not primarily hymns, but rather folk music, rock music, and folk rock music. A great example coming straight out of Moundridge, Kansas, to kind of pick up some of these styles here, and who you can hear perform, I believe, tomorrow, are Doug and Jude Crable, who here you can see in Normal, Illinois, at a conference performing in 1989, but of course with guitar, electric bass, and even drums in the background of this photo. And I kind of refer to this era as the advent of the guitar era, right? Where you start to see not only 4-part arrangements in hymnals, but, sorry that this ended up quite small, but you might know what I'm talking about here. You start to see these little letters appearing above some of these things. What are those for? Well, those are chord symbols. Guitarists know how to read those and can accompany, right? You can do away even with the piano and have your guitar here. And I'll say for my part, a lot of these songs were things in this style of kind of folky music, are things that I learned at camp. They were things that were initially billed as youth music, right? But as people who were youth in the 1960s know, right? Youth doesn't stick around, right? But the songs often do, right? And the traditions of the things that you sang. And so this next selection is one that comes from my youth, and is also by another Schweitzer, Nathan Stuckey, and I think is appearing, at least in Mennonite hymnals, for the first time in Voices Together. This is number 173, and I'm going to invite Nathan Stuckey who's also my cousin, to come forward and lead this from the guitar for us. And I'll just say that this was another special place for me and maybe other Schweitzers and local Mennonites. I learned it at Camp Mennonite, so this was a camp song initially, but I was delighted to see that now it's something that we can sing potentially every week as well. So that's all I have for you this evening from my part. I think we can close with this hymn together, and this is number 173. I'm happy to answer questions, but I think I can do that perhaps off the mic, unless I hear some other instruction from some of our organizers here. So thank you very much, and we'll sing this last song. And I'd invite you, Nate, to say anything about this if you'd like to, or if you just want to lead away.
Are we on here? Is the mic on? Yes. All right. No, I hadn't really prepared to say anything. Austin and I were texting earlier today, and he said, if it's natural, you might say a word or two. And then I said, I responded, well, what if it's unnatural? And he said, if I spoke unnaturally, I'd be cut off sharply at 1 minute.
I forgot to start the timer. It sounds like I might need it.
I think the only thing I will say is that I remember quite vividly where I was when I wrote this, and I was in my room while serving as summer staff as the music director at Camp Mennonite, and just some of the themes that Austin has mentioned already. The text I can take no credit for. It's the Bible. You should read it sometime. And one of my favorite sort of melodic riffs in it, I borrowed from a 90s country music song by Diamond Rio, so you can go and try to find that somewhere. But I've been humbled to learn recently that they're still singing this at Kamenska. I didn't necessarily know that. So it's a kind of a humbling reminder of you never know what seeds will grow, and that's humbling and a little terrifying as well. So if you can stand and sing. If you know it. The Lord Jehovah, God is with you, who is mighty to save. God will join you, and will quiet you with love.
Thank you, Nathan. My name is Danielle Gehring. I haven't done nearly enough singing tonight. Maybe some of you feel the same. Some of you probably feel like you've been in one place, in one warm place for entirely too long. We're looking forward to tomorrow. We've got a taste of Nathan for Sunday. We've got a taste for Schweitzer language. We've got a lot to do tomorrow. So you are dismissed, but if anybody wants to hang around and sing another song or two, I think Bill would lead us in another couple of songs. Would some of you like to do that? But don't feel bad if you are ready to depart.